All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another Mindgasms podcast. Going to talk today to Tim Keefe and Shane Kennedy again, and we're going to talk about postmodernism, which I talk about a lot and which I know Shane absolutely loves. And going to go into the introduction and possibly the philosophy of postmodernism, two separate essays in, I believe it's the Cambridge Companion to Postmodernism. And so, yeah, why don't you guys go ahead and introduce yourselves to start off with?
Okay, so I'm Tim Keefe, and I am definitely a repeat offender now. So the listeners have probably heard me on previous podcasts, one of which happens to be on postmodernism with Andrew.
Yep.
And I'm here back again with our favorite subject.
Yep.
Yeah,
Shane?
and I'm fairly into philosophy and theology and thought. I haven't spent much time in postmodernism, so I'm interested in trying to figure out what, if anything, it's about.
All right. So, do you want to start off with an introduction there, Tim, and then you said you wanted to go through the notes that you took on the introduction in the book?
Yeah, sure. So I decided to bring the conversation back over to postmodernism and look at one of the Cambridge Companions, which for anybody that's getting into philosophy, I highly recommend as excellent introductions to not only topics but to figures. I think the Cambridge Companions have been around, I'd say, starting from the late 80s, because I remember seeing them in my undergraduate days. And since that time, they've just expanded to not only philosophy, but literature and science and all kinds of things. And the companions themselves are just collections of essays introductory to particular topics within that a larger topic or the figure themselves. So again, I highly recommend that somebody get a copy of those. They're usually in academic libraries if you need to get into more depth about a particular subject or person. And the ones who wrote them are sometimes fairly well-known figures themselves who wrote essays. So this time around, I wanted to focus on the Cambridge Companion to Postmodernism, which I think is sometime around the late 90s is when it came out. And I think it's a good representative collection for not simply philosophy, because in prior podcasts, stemming all the way to the first one I did with James, is that you can make the distinction between postmodernism and postmodernity, as I like to do. But if you want to focus on postmodernism, then it's not simply about philosophy. Far from it. The essays in the Cambridge Companion cover things like philosophy, which we'll touch on tonight, but also film, literature, art, performance, architecture, and science. There's a couple other ones too, but that kind of spans the gamut of different subjects that fall with under postmodernism.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important distinction too, the difference between postmodernism and the postmodern era too. That's it's something that people forget a lot of the time, I think.
Right. So what I'd like to do for tonight is initially what the three of us had discussed was to take the companion itself and split out the essays. So I will start off with the introduction and the philosophy essay because it provides a lot of the groundwork. And then most likely we're going to split this out into probably another episode where we're going to cover some of the other essays concerning film or literature and things like that. And it's a triage that we decided to do, but each one of us has been through the essays at least once, and we have notes to compare and discuss the themes that are in here. And what I really would like to do, touching on my earlier mentioning of trying to cover postmodernism as a whole as much as we can, instead of focusing specifically on philosophy, because as I had mentioned in previous podcasts, I first became aware of postmodernism in the early 90s when I was an undergraduate. And that was I wouldn't call it its high water mark, but it definitely was cresting a wave. And then it sort of fizzled out sometime in the late 90s. You didn't hear much about it from then until nowadays, with the likes of people like Jordan Peterson. And then postmodernism now has become this boogeyman, this moniker that is a collection of things that people don't like in the contemporary culture.
Yeah.
I think that has something to do with the people trained in that age now reaching tenured positions. Right? I think there might be a correlation there.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So without further ado, let's go ahead and look at the introductory essay by Stephen Connor, which is, if anybody's playing the home game, is on page 1. Okay. So I think Connor's essay does a very good job of the broad brushstrokes of postmodernism. So on the first page, in the first paragraph, he says, and I'm going to quote him here, "Surely the first thing to be said about postmodernism at this hour, after 3 decades of furious business and ringing tills, is that it must nearly be at an end. But in chess, from which Beckett's play takes its title," and he mentions some Beckett's endgame, "the endgame is not the end of the game, but the game of ending that forms part of it and may be looked towards from the beginning." Okay, so what he's talking about here is 30 years. And I think, again, this was written sometime either the late 90s or the early 2000s. So postmodernism as a movement or a subject has been around for a few decades now. And as he gets to later in the introduction, he's going to divide it into 3 separate sections. So continuing in the second paragraph, again, I will quote, he says, "For postmodernism has indeed shown an extraordinary capacity to renew itself in the conflagration of its demise. One might almost say that the derivative character of postmodernism, the name of which indicates that it comes after something else, modernism, modernity, or the modern, guarantees it an extended tenure that the naming of itself as an ex nihilo, meaning from nothing, beginning might not. You can credibly inaugurate a new beginning only for a short so long, whereas you can carry on succeeding upon something almost indefinitely, catching continuing success from your predecessor's surcease or ending." So one crude way to look at this is postmodernism is like a cockroach. Can't seem to kill it. It seems to reemerge.
This visualization works for me. Yeah.
That's the problem that Jordan Peterson has with it.
Yeah, it's like a cockroach to kill it. But okay, so I assume that both of you guys have read the introductory essay, or at least glanced over it. So do you accept so far what Connor is getting at here in these 2 quotes? Is, it's not an ending, it's beginning of an ending or something other than that, and that postmodernism has just seemed to keep reemerging, even though it had met its demise sometime, I'd say, in the late 90s.
Yeah.
Does that strike you as, I mean, the fact that Jordan Peterson brought it up within the past few years is testament to the fact that the thing just doesn't die. It reemerges.
Yeah.
I would put forward that it could be, instead of all that eloquent stuff that was just said, that there was the first round and those people are now teaching it and occupying positions of power. So it's it's still the same phenomenon. Like, you could argue that it's just those people just didn't have cachet or weren't as vocal for a while. And now they are again. I mean, I don't know, but it might just be as simple as it's like saying, I was taught something when I was a kid, and then I left the country for 10 years, and I came back and I started talking about it again. So,
well, if you're talking about, like, specifically what Jordan Peterson seems to be referring to, I would say that it has changed, but yeah, I mean, because it's very different, at least from, like, especially if you look at Foucault and Derrida, for example, if we're talking about specifically the type of people that Jordan Peterson seems to have a problem with, I would say.
Yeah, and just a note about Derrida and Foucault, they were most active in the 70s and the 80s.
Yeah.
And, Foucault, he died in 84, so that was some time ago. Derrida, I think it was 2004, so that was also a little short while ago, not as far back as 1984. So they're no longer active figures.
No, of course not.
But certainly there has been a lot written about the both of them in the past 25 to 30 years.
And having thought about it some more, and the little I've learned from Andrew, it definitely has changed, because even with my uninformedness of it, what it seemed to be in the 90s that I've been hearing is very different from what I see it manifesting today, which is very different from what I hear Andrew describe it as back at the source time. So this idea that it has been reborn multiple times is actually making a lot more sense to me now that I think about it. So.
Right. And so continuing on with Connor's essay, he mentions this in the third paragraph, again on page 1. 4 different stages in the development: accumulation, synthesis, autonomy, and dissipation. So the first stage he lays out in the 70s and the early part of the 80s, which definitely you could say was like the high water mark of postmodernism. This is when it first started to emerge on the scene. It was a new field. It was all the rage, sort of. This is when you had Lyotard first coming onto the scene, because he wrote the Postmodern Condition in 79. That's when the French version was. And then Charles Jenks, who is very well associated with it, particularly as far as architecture. These are when they first emerged on the scene. So Connor continues on the second page, where he says that in the first stage, the 70s and 80s, it was a genuine puzzle for anyone trying to get a secure fix on the term postmodern to make the different sorts of argument applied to different kinds of object lineup. Okay. And so what he's getting at here is it was kind of a ragtag bunch that were writing at the time, Foucault, Derrida, Jameson, and so on, that each could be subsumed under the moniker of postmodern. But they wouldn't have described themselves as such. Certainly Foucault did not, Derrida did not, Lyotard, because he wrote the Postmodern Condition, it was just a term that he probably came up with to describe that, even though he was not the inventor of the term. Okay. So again, this is when it was emerging on the scene.
Who was it who invented the term?
Well, that's a good question. If you read Perry Anderson's one book, The Condition, what was it? The Origins of Postmodernity. And Perry Anderson is a Marxist historian. He is not a philosopher or a theorist. And that book came out sometime in the late 90s. He traces as far back into South America around the 1920s.
Oh, wow.
When the term first emerged. But again, the thing you have to remember about postmodernism is it applies more to art and aesthetics.
Yeah.
From then, literature and so on. Not really so much in philosophy.
Yeah.
Key distinction.
Yeah.
Okay. So then Connor continues is that in the middle of the 1980s, this is when Frederick Jameson's essay first appears, The Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, which originally was a long-form essay, and then it became a book in the early 90s. So this was, for all intents and purposes, the first systematic treatment, a book-length treatment of what postmodernism was, at least according to Jameson. Okay, so we've already covered Jameson in the previous podcast, what he had to say about that. His hallmarks of what consists of the postmodern. So then moving on, Connor says, the effect of this, meaning Jameson's treatment of it, was that by the beginning of the 1990s, the concept of the postmodern was ceasing to be principally used in the analysis of particular objects or cultural areas and had become a general horizon or hypothesis. Okay, key distinction here. So instead of applying postmodern to, say, like artistic objects or aesthetics, things like that, it then shifted to become what's the postmodern, or the postmodern condition, or the postmodern era, something like that. So there was a notable shift here at the beginning of the 1990s. And again, this is when I first became aware of it. I was aware when Jameson's book first came out, never read it because I thought it was a little too dense for me, as is a lot of Jameson's work. And I never really paid that much attention to it. I just kind of approached it here and there, hearing about it so often, indirectly. Okay, I'll read a little bit of Derrida here, read a little bit of Foucault here, maybe a little bit of Jameson if I could grapple with it, because he doesn't write always in the clearest English. and all these other kinds of commentaries that were popping up here and then. So I gradually and casually became aware of it. But then, as Connor has mentioned, is that it's not really limited towards one particular area. It's just this postmodern era type thing they're talking about. What do you think, Shane? Do you get that impression too?
My comments would be very superficial. I mean, that's kind of the feeling I get. Like, I've seen posters from the 90s. I've kind of seen it more in an art realm. But I don't really think I have anything of value to add, except this sounds very plausible and consistent with my very, very limited understanding. So, yeah.
I think you and I might agree about that in terms of art, in particular, Shane, because I don't know much about postmodern art at all, but I am endlessly confused as why people think it's like amazing or anything like that.
And this is actually also consistent with a description of postmodernism that James Lindsay gave, because the way they were talking about it, and they really don't like it, was that it was at the end of the 90s that it kind of had to morph into something that was looking for a purpose. And then that's where the nefarious themes start to arise, where at one point it was art, it was this, it was that, but then eventually kind of, way they would just say, it ran out of things to deconstruct, and then it morphed into something different. So that was the characterization they gave of it that I heard. So I can't verify that, right?
And this is one of the other essays in the companion?
No, this is the guys who did who just did those hoax papers.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah. Have you heard of those, Tim?
Oh yeah, that was a big brouhaha in the 90s. The so-called hoax.
Yeah.
No. We're talking about the more recent one that happened this past year, where.
Oh yeah. Well, that's of a piece of the so-called hoax, which is very famous, very well known in the mid 90s, where Alan Sokal, who is the physicist, wrote that one paper for, what was the journal Social Text. I forget its title, but that was his attempt to just show how a lot of this is bullshit.
Yeah,
but it was accepted in a serious enough academic journal where the joke was on them in the end.
Yeah, well, it's just like the example that Shane and I discussed before, where Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay and one other professor who
Kate something or rather, I can't remember what.
Yeah, I always forget her name, but they got several papers published in peer-reviewed academic journals about things like whether dogs are transgender, and they lifted direct quotes from Mein Kampf and replaced the word Jew with the word man and stuff like that.
Yeah, Cuck Philosophy had a video on the so-called hoax, and he was able to kind of talk about how the guy kind of backtracked a little bit afterwards, how he kind of engaged with some sort of more superficial aspects, and then perhaps it was like partially the subject matter that allowed it to occur. So, and it sounded a plausible way to say the so-called hoax wasn't super invalidating, and I can't really speak to it too strongly. Whereas my impression of this more modern one, it's not as direct an attack on postmodernism per se, but it seems to be a little bit more, let's say, of a sustained, given its breadth, seems to be a little bit more of a sustained attack on whatever it was trying to attack by doing this hoax. But anyways, those were the characters, and they kind of, they themselves in their own understandings seem to acknowledge that a shift did happen in the way it was being applied. So that's very consistent with the narrative that this introduction's laying out.
Yeah, No, go ahead.
But as a postmodernist, though, I don't like consistency, so it doesn't do anything for me.
Yeah, well, the most notable thing about the Boghossian, the transgender thing about the dogs, is that now you're really getting into, I mean, in the so-called hoax, it was about physics. Okay, so you could take what was considered, quote, postmodern, and then he wrote with Jean Bricmont, it was called Fashionable Nonsense. That was a follow-up book to that, where they were pillorying the postmodernists, or at least the thinkers that fall underneath that moniker, having a laugh at their expense. Just showing how it's it's misapplied, or they don't understand physics or whatever it is. And yeah, Shane, I remember, when he backtracked from that, and that kind of went away in the 90s. But this recently really shines a light more on things like gender studies and identity politics.
Yes.
Yeah, that sort of thing, like gender studies and identity politics being somehow correlated with postmodernism seems fairly new too.
Yeah, but it's the same kind of gambit.
Yeah.
We're just going to show how you really take this to the extent where it seems silly. It really looks farcical.
Yeah.
And they fall for it.
Yeah.
Needless to say.
Yeah.
Okay. But continuing on in Connor's essay. So then on page 3, he makes some comments here about postmodernism was the practice, again referring to the mid-90s. Postmodernism was the practice of critical distraction, literally being drawn aside. Postmodernism arose from the amalgamation of these many deflections or diagonal gazes. Okay, so that's an important note here. And as kinship patterns among postmodernists became more important than patterns of descent, meaning going down, analogical postmodernism took the place of genealogical postmodernisms. So in other words, they were not so concerned about the origin of postmodernism, genealogical. Now it is more like, what kind of a distraction is it?
That's what it means by analogical.
Analogical, an analogy, right?
Comparison. What do they mean by distraction?
A distraction, well, let's see. Moving up, what does he say? He says, if one wanted to pin down the postmodernist features of some unlikely object of analysis, war, say, or prostitution, or circus, the thing to do was to look directly not at your target, but what lay in its periphery. That's what he means by a distraction, literally being drawn aside. Okay?
Okay.
I'm going to just hold on to that thought. Okay, go on. That's great.
Yeah, so putting this another way, instead of critically focusing on one particular subject, you're approaching it from many different angles on the outside.
Oh, okay.
That's what the approach was. Okay, so then continuing on.
Wait, is this consistent with the idea of decentering an idea?
Yes.
Okay.
Decentering an idea.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. So then he continues, but synthesis brought its own problems. Postmodernist theory responded to the sense that important changes had taken place in politics, economics, and social life. Changes that could broadly be characterized by the two words delegitimation and de-differentiation. Authority and legitimacy were no longer so powerfully concentrated in the centers they had previously occupied. And the differentiations, for example, those between what had been called centers and margins, but also between classes, regions, and cultural levels, high and low culture, were being eroded or complicated. Okay, so going back to what you were saying, Shane, is a decentering was going on, not to mention a delegitimation.
This is literally as close, like it sounds like the exact opposite way of looking at the world from a religious perspective. Like
that's why you have a problem with it.
Well, I've been reading this book by Eliade. He's a religious historian, and basically he draws out the way that religion orients a person in the world, like the cosmology it creates. It's the same way of just saying the orientation mechanism. And so across all cultures, the one thing they have in common is they all have like usually an origin story. So essentially what those stories serve to do is to create a center and to create distinctions between, your tribe, the other tribe, day, night, hot, cold, good, evil, so the whole exactly. So the whole project of the oldest forms of thought we know was about establishing, well, for survival purposes, you could argue, what is legitimate, what is going to allow us to survive, how are we going to perceive the world that we can live in it together? That's where the cosmology creation comes from. So it's this would be, and I mean, so it's very interesting how it seems. Is it accidental that it's an antithesis to the traditional way of thinking, or is that a coincidence, or is that intentional? Do you have any thought on that, or is that something we'll encounter later?
Well, I think I think it's a collection of all of them because, you know, remember what we had covered before is that postmodernism was a reaction to modernity.
Yeah.
And definitely when you're looking at it sociologically, as Bauman does, you know, one of my favorite ways of approaching it is that modernity still continues, but high modernity, you could say, no longer holds. And
I think I know what you mean. Yeah.
Yeah, and so if you know, hearkening back to Lyotard, one of the, you know, the core, you could say, shibboleths of postmodernism is the incredulity towards grand narratives.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's both a decentering, sort of, and a delegitimation. So you can no longer explain things in terms of a world or a eschatological approach, if you want to use religion, or the Marxist approach, or the capitalist approach, or something like that, the delegitimation of it.
Yeah. And in terms of societies sort of becoming less religious and stuff like that, like you were, as you were mentioning, Shane, this is why I think I might have mentioned to you before that particularly postmodern writers like Bauman, who look at this from a more sociological perspectives, actually kind of have some agreements with people like Jordan Peterson. Like, they're not saying it's a good thing that societies have lost their rigid religious values, and that, like, for example, if you're looking at like Hollywood, for example, it's making society more superficial, and you can see negative consequences that come from some of these things.
Yeah, and I mean, by way of agreeing with you, so to speak, or it's I mean, new lenses are gonna help you discover things, and who knows what certain ways of looking at things will lead you to, right? So that's why I'm quite happy to go through it. I would just quickly reference kind of the way we talked about what Heidegger talked about with how Nietzsche was trying to move past metaphysics. I don't see any evidence that that's possible. Or that anybody's created. Well, just let me finish a second. I just don't see any evidence that there's a certainly not coherent, or I don't I mean, maybe it is possible, but my position would be that until you can put forward a system that isn't based on metaphysics, then you can't really put forward a system that's non-religious, because if you're acting out any kind of principles, by definition, it's just a variation on a theme of what principles you're acting out. Because I don't know how you act out a decentered. Like, you can look at something in a decentered way, but I would put forward that once you act, you center an action, right?
But so that's an essentialist narrative, though. That's saying that everyone experiences the world the same way.
No, I'm saying everyone experiences the world, and they don't experience a million worlds. They experience, by definition, you only experience what you experience, right? So there's
but that doesn't mean that because you're in your experience, like the way you act out your life is metaphysical, that applies to everyone equally, is what I'm saying. Not necessarily, anyway. That's entirely possible, but it's not like going from your experience to assume that that's the same as everyone else's experience is sort of an essentialist narrative.
Okay, well, I mean, we'll pin this thought because we'll
have
kind of time to dive in and out of it.
We don't need to get sidetracked.
Yeah, but I wouldn't say I would just say I don't want to be making an essentialist argument. I might be inadvertently doing so. I'm trying to say, I would say that the fact that everybody has an experience is a commonality. So I think there are some commonalities, and you obviously wouldn't want to project those too far. But if it's essentialist to make the idea that everybody at least has an experience and we all have the experience of experience in common, that I would at least try to make that claim.
Yeah. We all have experience for sure, but we don't necessarily have the same experience. I'm just, let me put this a different way. Like saying that everyone has a metaphysical experience, that might be the case, but saying that everyone has, like, everyone has it in the, like, saying that everyone does have a metaphysical experience, like, as if you know that, is kind of like saying the opposite, which is one accusation of postmodernists, which often is not true, but is, like, for the sake of argument, if we assume that the claim that postmodernists claim that there is no like narrative there is no meta narrative, or there is no grand meta narrative or anything like that, then it would be the same sort of thing. And I'm just saying, I don't know, I don't know which of those is true or whether neither of them is true. It seems like it's kind of up in the air to me. That's all.
Well, just throw it back to Tim then, because maybe I missed, because I thought I was just repeating what Heidegger said. Because I thought.
I think you were. Yeah.
Okay. I was just agreeing with Heidegger. I was just saying when Heidegger says Nietzsche was trying to move past metaphysics, Nietzsche wasn't sure how to do it, hadn't completed that. As far as I know, no one's put forward a conception of the world, postmodern or otherwise, that has been able to not still resort to metaphysics the way Nietzsche wasn't able to move past it. So am I understanding? Well, I just want to ask Tim. Am I understanding Heidegger's claim first, even if we don't know if any theory of thought has moved past it? Am I characterizing what he said correctly, or
right? Because Heidegger had characterized Nietzsche as the last metaphysician.
Okay, so does that mean there are people who do the same thing but aren't metaphysicians, or like is there philosophy without metaphysics? Without
no, I mean the point of Heidegger's analysis, we covered this in the essay, is that Nietzsche, in his attempt to get beyond metaphysics, didn't do so because
okay.
When he pronounced the death of God, that was the death of the supersensible realm. Okay, that much is clear on the face of it. But with the will to power in particular, he desacralized more or less, and then the will to power is kind of a metaphysical principle. Yeah. So he never really did get beyond metaphysics because he asserted the will to power.
Okay, so are you aware of anybody who has got past metaphysics in the way Nietzsche wasn't able to, without going into great detail? But I mean, is that even a thing that somebody has claimed to have done, or?
Well, no. I mean, anybody who's gotten beyond metaphysics, I highly doubt it, because in contemporary philosophy, meaning like late 19th century onwards, metaphysics has reemerged. And in fact, even today, they still talk about metaphysics. Lots have been written about it.
Okay, that was the only point I was trying to make at the beginning. It's like metaphysics is a grounding in something.
Yeah.
And by definition, if you ground something in it, then if you're acting that out, that's my definition of religion.
And it could even be argued too that Derrida sort of had a metaphysics in a way, like when you read what he says about religion and stuff that time, sometimes I think that, especially I've heard James Sullivan say this on his podcast too, a little bit, go into like how Derrida talks about metaphysics and how he's used that because he's become a Christian and he's trying to reconcile that with his postmodern beliefs, sort of.
Well, let's go ahead and just pin this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Thank you for entertaining it, Tim. Appreciate it.
Sure. Okay, so back to the counter essay. Let me see. All right, so he continues. This is a really good quote here. He says, some accounts of postmodernism depended on the argument that not only had the conditions of social and economic organization changed, but so as an effect of those changes had the relations between the social and economic and the artistic cultural. Drawing on the early work of Baudrillard, Frederick Jameson saw that, rather than subsisting in a state of fidgety internal exile, the sphere of culture was in fact undergoing a prodigious expansion in an economy driven by sign, style, and spectacle rather than by the production of goods. Important shift, moving from heavy industrial capitalism to a consumer-type economy, and in particular with the Baudrillard patina on it, is being lost in the spectacle and signs.
Yeah, I remember, that's another thing I remember Bauman going over too that I found interesting, and I think we might have talked about that at the time too, how this shift into the more, like the sort of more materialistic mindset in our capitalist system.
Right, but also another key term in Baudrillard is the hyperreal.
Yeah, exactly.
So there is what does that mean, the hyperreal? So there is something that we call the real. Now, however we want to define it, the real world, you could say. But Baudrillard, and sometimes, I remember telling James this in the very beginning, is that you can't take Baudrillard too much at face value, because he likes to play with words, and you know what he writes about sometimes will strike you as very odd, very
Yeah,
strange.
that's something that like it took me a while to understand with especially early postmodern writers like Derrida and Foucault too. And like once I understood that, it kind of helped me understand them better, because they're kind of being metaphorical and deliberately provocative sometimes.
Right, especially Baudrillard. So there is this thing we call the real, but because we live in a world, you know, Baudrillard was writing about this from the 80s onwards, that is mediated by television at the time, and now we have the internet, videos, you know, reality TV, fake news. You know, you could lump a whole lot of that in there. Is proceeding on the sign. Okay, so no longer is it important for the good, and this is in particular with capitalist production. No longer is the good the most important, but it is the sign of the good, or what does the good represent? You know, toothpaste is
Yeah.
toothpaste. However, does it matter that you brush your teeth with Colgate whitening versus cinnamon, you know, mouthwash type toothpaste or
Yeah.
whatever it is? You know,
This is the
toothpaste is toothpaste.
this is that idea of the hyper real, right?
Yeah, but more particularly when you're talking about the internet. You know,
Yeah,
let's
yeah,
look at video games, or Second Life. That was from some years back. I know that was a thing, what, 10, 15 years ago. I'm not so much sure now. That's an excellent example of the hyperreal. Okay.
yeah,
So you're existing in a virtual world. There is the real, but there is something that is also real, even more real than the real.
yeah. I think the newest version of that might be Minecraft.
Yeah. Minecraft, and now what would you say Fortnite falls in that category too?
Yeah, I don't actually know much about that, but I did hear that recently.
Yeah, I
I
haven't
would
played video games in years.
I would
I
say
don't know.
that's actually I think that phenomenon exists in a lot of ways because
Yeah,
without going to the political dimension, just looking at the statement in face value, like when Cortez said to Anderson Cooper, I'm
AOC.
pretty sure AOC, when she said it's like, well, it's not the facts, it's my feelings about what I want to achieve. She said something like that. So
Yeah,
it's I live in a world where it's my intentions and the world I'm trying to create. That's what's real. It's so it's
yeah,
I correct me if I'm wrong, but I see a parallel there where it's not so much whether we can or can't afford it, do or do not. It's just there's this world we're trying to create that we're going to live in, and that's what's important to focus on. And I kind of see that as degrounded by definition. If you deground from facts, degrounded from traditional definitions of the real, and you're moving into this new definition or this new created real, which would be a hyper real. Am I close at all to using that term correctly, or not?
Yeah, what I would recommend, Shane, is you go back and listen to the series I did with James, because I touched on Baudrillard there, going through
Also,
the
that
sign regimes.
guy, also that guy, Rick Roderick, who you recommended to me, Tim, who I love
Hmm.
his lectures. I forget which episode it is, or whether it's more than one, but you should check some of his lectures out, Shane. He talks about hyperreal at least once, and he does a really good job of explaining it. The lectures are in the 90s, but the way that he describes it still applies equally today, if not even more so, because this was before everyone had internet and social media and had carried it with us on our phones everywhere.
Yeah, I'll send you the link, Shane.
Okay, cool.
Okay. All right. So continuing with O'Connor, his quote, science spectacle, rather production of goods. Okay. Continuing. The plucky attempts of commentators to legislate terminologically between these realms, insisting, as I myself attempted to do in my book, Postmodernist Culture, on the difference between postmodernity on the one hand and postmodernism on the other. That sounds very Bauman to me. Were in fact mistakenly tidy-minded responses to a more fundamental coalescence in which politics and economy had become culturized, art and culture sociologized, and postmodernity had itself become postmodernist. Nice little twist there. It is perhaps for this reason that the 1980s saw such a proliferation of variants of the words used to describe the phenomena under discussion. How one capitalized or hyphenated, and he goes through postmodern, post-modern, capital post-modern, postmodern, postmodern, many different ways you could do this, seemed to many to matter a great deal, along with whether one chose to refer to postmodernism, postmodernity, or simply the postmodern. Okay, so in a nutshell, what he's discussing here is that, and I think he touches on this later, definitely under modernity, you had more strict separation between the political, the social, the artistic, cultural, to take four. Now with postmodernism, the boundaries fuzz and they start to overlap and they start to coalesce, and you can look at it now, kind of starting back in the 80s, is that for all intents and purposes, one way to describe it is that politics is kind of a shit show, or more charitably, it's kind of a reality TV show. Okay, so
It's hyper real.
now you see on display what the guy's talking about.
Yeah.
What do you think, Shane? You agree with that?
Yeah. I can see many parallels of this phenomenon. I think
Like,
Twitter bubbles might be another example.
I think South Park summed up the 2016 American presidential election better than anyone else by referring to the main leading candidates as a giant douche and a turd sandwich.
So if I'm understanding it correctly, it seems a very apt description of what this guy's going through, what he's describing in the 80s, and prophetic perhaps even. So
yeah, and I lived through the 80s, and so looking back retrospectively, it is, yeah, you really started to see the blurring there. They certainly didn't have reality TV shows, thank God, back in those days. I mean, when you're dealing with TV, you know that it was TV. You knew that it was fake from the beginning. And then when reality TV emerged on the scene, I'm just like, oh man.
Yeah.
But anyways,
I have relatives who watch those shows, and I've no. If you want to do whatever you want to do is fine with me, but that I don't understand why people enjoy them.
Yeah. I have no comment. Okay, so continuing on. Now Connor had described the first phase as being the late 70s and the 80s. The second syncretic phase, when things were starting to mush together, there was another subtle shift, he said, in the place of the word postmodernism. Then he says, quote, "This word was now a name for not only for the way in which new attitudes and practices had evolved in particular areas of society and culture, in architecture, in literature, in patterns of economic or political organization, but also for the characteristic discourse in which such things were discussed." Okay. So, key point there. Now you were starting to see, I mean, let's look at Lyotard's thing about the postmodern condition. Okay. So, for me, when I read that, that's a very clear work to read through the language. It's a little bit difficult because it's academic, but it's very clear that what he's laying out. This is my conception, he says, of what the postmodern is. Very clear definitions, incredulity towards grand narratives about the information society, even back in 1979, and so on and so forth. Then you shift going into the mid-90s. What do you start seeing? Things like the Sokol paradox, the Sokol hoax, those kind of articles. Then fast forwarding about 15, 20 years later, you get the Bogosian hoax. Okay, so a shift in the discourse and how such things were discussed. Some of it is still, like Lyotard, very clear the way it discusses it. Others just really goes out there on a limb, kind of wackadoodle.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure we've seen a lot of that.
Yep.
Okay. So then Connor continues. By the middle of the 1990s, a third stage had involved, as the post idea had achieved a kind of autonomy from its objects. At this point, the argument about whether there really was such a thing as postmodernism, which had driven earlier discussions of the subject, started to evaporate, since the mere fact that there was discourse at all about the subject was now sufficient proof of the existence of postmodernism. But as idiom rather than actuality, postmodernism became the name for the activity of writing about postmodernism. Okay, what do you think? What do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, it does. Like some of these essays, I haven't read them in a while, but I reread two before tonight. I didn't do as much as I wanted to, but it seems to be more writing about postmodernism than actually doing postmodernist writing, if that makes sense.
Right. And even bringing Jordan Peterson back into this, where postmodernism has come a boogeyman.
Yeah.
Without clearly defining what it is.
Yeah,
Or
yeah.
you're defining it very narrowly about relativism, no respect for science, doubts about the truth, your feelings matter, all of this stuff. So it's just become this caricature of itself almost. But as Connor is saying, in the 1990s, postmodernism just kind of disappeared. And now writing about it almost instantiated it. Because you were writing about postmodernity means that it existed almost. But who could really actually point in the world and say, yeah, this was postmodern?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
Okay. Everybody good so far?
Yeah.
Okay. So continuing on, Connor says, having expanded its range and dominion hugely during the first period of separate accumulation in the 1970s and the syncretic period of the 1980s, the idea of the postmodern began for the first time to slow its rate of expansion during the 1990s. True statement. You didn't see as much in the late 90s as you did in the early 90s. By this time, postmodernism had also entered the popular lexicon to signify a loose, sometimes dangerously loose, relativism. Aha. Now its dominant associations were with post-colonialism, multiculturalism, and identity politics. So whereas postmodernism had expanded its reach in academic discussion, it had shrunk down to a causal term of abuse in more popular discourse. Postmodernism had become autonomous from its objects. Okay. So starting in the 90s is when people started to look at this as a boogeyman. Then it just kind of silently went away, and then it reemerged.
Yeah, it's like you said, it's the cockroach.
It's like a cockroach, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. But is that a fair estimation? What Connor gives? Does this kind of ring true? I mean, you're only looking at it now. You're not looking at it back in the 90s. You'd have to go back to what was written in the mid to late 90s to get a better sense of what he's discussing here.
I mean, I was like in the 90s for the most part. I was too young to really observe culture and society because I was like around 10 in 2000 because I was born in 89. So
how about you, Shane?
I mean, this is exactly how I've heard people who don't know anything about postmodernism apparently describe postmodernism. So far, it's exactly what I would have said before I read the book, or my understanding was. So it seems very consistent.
Okay, so we're now in the third stage, according to Connor, of postmodernism. It's this boogeyman term, more or less.
Yeah.
And a term of abuse. Okay. So, moving along. Okay, Connor continues. He says, one of the earliest commentators of postmodernism, Daniel Bell, who himself is a sociologist, very good one at that, made the suggestion that something like a postmodern condition arose when the utopian ideals and lifestyles associated with modern artists began to be diffused among populations as fashion, lifestyle, and consumer choice. Okay. So
that makes me think of our current political climate a lot too.
How so?
Like this idea of saying that you are part of this group because it makes you seem righteous. Like I am a progressive, so I am righteous, or I'm a conservative, so I am righteous, and we are facing an enemy and they are doing bad things and we need to stop them and we are all on the righteous team.
Okay.
Like not actually believing those things, but saying them. That this term virtue signaling that I've heard from Michael Shermer a lot, that's what it makes me think about, because it's the superficial saying of your political opinions rather than like your genuine ones, seemingly. Yeah, that's what I mean.
What do you think, Shane?
I'm completely agree so far. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So continuing on, Connor says, The well-known tendency of many of the thinkers and theorists associated with postmodernism to focus on modernists, again, postmodernity is a reaction against the modernists. And he cites Lacan on Joyce, James Joyce, Derrida on Mallarmé, Foucault on Raymond Roussel, might have offered support for the view that early postmodernist formulations were attempting to reinstate something like the heroic refusal of modern life that constituted artistic modernism. Artistic modernism, okay, the whole genre of what the modern is. Whereas the modernity refused by modernists was the modernity of urban transformation, mass production, and speed of transport and communications. Okay, so let me focus on that for a minute. If you're aware of the history of art, modernism emerged in the late 19th and the early 20th century. So yes, I've been into enough in museums, I've seen enough of these artworks, and I can speak to them, that particularly around 1914 or so, after the First World War, all the changes that were happening and the traumatization that happened after World War I, you see a lot of modernism, So it is reactions against that life-transforming. This is what the modernists were reacting to in modernity. Making a distinction there between modernism as the artistic movement and modernity as the force that is happening. So, continuing, the modernity refused by postmodernists was that of consumer capitalism, in which the world, forcibly wrenched into new material forms by modernity, was being transformed by being immaterialized, transformed into various kinds of spectacle. Harkening back to Baudrillard again.
This difference between this distinction between like different eras of modernism and as like is similar to postmodernism is helpful too.
Tim's muted himself.
Yeah, you muted yourself, Tim.
Oh, sorry. Talking to myself.
Okay.
So, yeah, the importance of this companion is that it focuses a lot more on the art.
Yeah.
Where you can start to see it's not devoted to modernism. It touches on that a little bit.
Yeah.
But, how postmodernity as a reaction, modernists reacted against modernity too.
Yeah.
Postmodernity is reacting against modernity in a different sense. So early modernism was the urban transformation, mass production, large-scale capitalism, and so on. Modernism reacts against that, and then taking it to a higher level with the style, the spectacle, immaterialization, as Connor describes it. This is what the postmodernists are reacting against in modernity.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's interesting in this companion, and when we get to it later, I'm excited to talk about that, like what they say about film and literature and stuff like that.
Right. Okay. So Connor continues. So he touches on Jameson again, and there are three particular possibilities he outlines as the idea of the postmodern, because he says the range of possibilities would be as follows. The first one is you believe in postmodernism and be all for it. Okay, and then he cites Charles Jenks, who in the contemporary world coined the term postmodernism as it applied to architecture. And then there's Lyotard with the postmodern condition. Okay, so this is you believe in postmodernism and to be all for it. Okay, got it. Option number two is you could believe in postmodernism but nevertheless recoil from or be opposed to it. And this is David Harvey, his excellent book, The Condition of Postmodernity, which I cover with James. Jameson, who was not a fan of the postmodern, and another French theorist, Paul Virilio, who we're not going to touch on here. And then a third option is one could not believe in postmodernism and not be for it. So neither nor here. And this was the position occupied by the critics of the postmodern turn, as well as the Marxist cultural critics who believed that postmodernism was a snare and a delusion that mystified the real basis of domination and gave up prematurely on modernity. This was more specifically Jameson,
Yeah.
but
Yeah,
also
the Marxist critiques of postmodernism are interesting.
yeah, I mean, also particularly Jürgen Habermas, who was influenced by the Frankfurt School.
Yeah, that's interesting too, how that connection to the Frankfurt School.
Right, and as I remember, James had pointed out, he found it interesting that, because I was covering both Harvey and Jameson, is that, isn't it interesting that a Marxist is the one that has one of the most scathing critiques of postmodernism?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. That's why this term like postmodern-Neo-Marxist doesn't make sense to me.
Or a cultural Marxist, all those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's because you don't know your Marxism, really.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So moving right along.
I'll quickly mention that I think the connection between Marxism and postmodernism is because postmodernism is such a great tool of deconstruction and decentering. If your goal is to have a revolution, then you're going to want to be a postmodernist when it comes time to attack, let's say, modernity or capitalism or whatever it is that's standing in your way of your revolution. When that lens gets turned around and deconstructs your Marxism, you're not going to like it.
But Marxists don't deconstruct things; they construct things. If we're talking about the same sort of thing.
Well, a lot of Marxists believe it's like from the ashes rises the new thing. There's going to be a revolution. We're going to have to overthrow the existing power structure to have the revolution, right? So if you wanted to decenter a current grand narrative, for instance, or you wanted to get rid of the old way of looking at things, postmodernism would be a lens where you could delegitimize it, for instance. And I think that's the connection they're trying to draw, which is when it's convenient for you, you would put on your postmodernist hat and deconstruct something, delegitimize it, but at the same time, you don't want that to turn around on your Marxism. So
but
I think that's what
we're talking about rhetorically deconstructing things in terms of postmodernism, though.
Well, exactly, right? So if I'm a Marxist and I want to overthrow the existing system, when it comes time to criticize every other system, I want to be a postmodernist. I want to decenter it. I want to delegitimize it. That would be a logical thing for me to do, right? Because I want to replace it. Like that would not make sense? Or
well, let me jump in. Let me jump in here. Let me jump in here for a minute. So I get Shane's point. And, you know, in fact, I really recommend somebody read Harvey's book, The Condition of Postmodernity, because he is a Marxist, still is.
Yeah.
Has really done excellent series on diving into Marxist Capital, which has been around for at least 10 years now. And he's done this stretching 40 years or so. But, you know, the problem that Marxists have with postmodernity is that, yes, in some respects, it delegitimizes the classical teleological conception of Marxism, the revolution of the proletariat, overthrow of the capitalist system, blah, blah, blah. Okay. That's what Lyotard's point was about the incredulity of the grand narratives. Okay. So that takes the wind out of the sails of Marxism, and he wasn't the only one that stated that either. And that presents a problem for Marxism. Yes, kind of delegitimizes it. On the other hand, the Marxists do have a point, and this is where Harvey and particularly Jameson come into this, is that postmodernism really isn't helpful. Yeah. At the very worst, it turns into mental masturbation.
Yeah.
Because you're not addressing it's like the same kind of critique that they say now with identity politics, and this is the same kind of critique that has been going for many years, is that all of this hullabaloo about identity politics really does not get to the core of socioeconomic problems. And in fact, one could say that all of this hullabaloo about identity politics is because that we live in a prosperous society. If we didn't live in a prosperous society, would one have the time or the inclination to be involved in such things? Who knows? It's an interesting question.
Yeah, That seems like an aspect of the postmodern era.
Yes. Okay. So I got your point, Shane. Does that make sense, what I said? Hello, Shane.
Yeah, no, it makes complete sense, because usually like the identity politics things, to the extent that they're postmodernist, I think they use it to, and this is me ascribing motive, so it's more an opinion than anything else. But I think one interpretation is, I have a goal and I don't want to justify it in a concrete way, so I just need some way to talk about a bunch of things that sound very intellectual, but really it's not what I'm talking about. I'm still going to have the same goal at the end of it, whether it's whatever it is that I'm trying to achieve through my power games, or my desire to move up a hierarchy, or whatever it is I'm trying to achieve. So I think that, to the extent that postmodernism sounds like I'm analyzing things, sometimes it makes it hard to understand directly what I'm saying. I do think that some people will basically, let's say, appropriate the trappings of postmodernism to kind of hide behind what they're actually doing, which is trying to put forward a grand narrative, or achieve some sort of goal that they don't want to come right out and say they're doing.
That's why they're postmodern, like people who call themselves like postmodern feminists, and why there's postmodern theology and that sort of thing.
Well, we're going to get to postmodern theology eventually. That's another companion.
Yeah.
We'll see what they have to say. But I don't, in the case of postmodern theology, I would say that that's not, the theologians who are involved in that are not necessarily putting up a smokescreen.
Oh yeah, I'm not saying that they are. I'm not saying that happens in general either.
Yeah, it's just, again, this whole term of postmodern is highly charged, and you must tread on it very carefully.
Yeah, like I think there's a difference between two different types of people that we're talking about here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know the difference, but somebody else might necessarily know the difference. Just got to be careful with the term postmodern. And that's why I like liquid modernity, Bauman's terms, but that's a separate issue.
Yeah, I do like that term too.
Okay. So Connor continues on. He cites Bruno Latour, who is a very well-known French theorist, in the one book, We Had Never Been Modern. So just briefly, what Latour calls the modern constitution, two absolutisms are coordinated here. One is the absolute separation of human culture from non-human nature, and two, the absolute separation of present from past. Okay. Modernity is characterized by the belief that there is no relation between these two kinds of object, or between the two kinds of knowledge. We're talking about economic, social, that distinction I had mentioned before, by the requirement that they should be kept rigorously distinct. And I touched on this earlier with the way modernity approaches things. Latour is also supporting this. Connor continues saying, the originality of Latour's argument is that the very moment at which modernity invents this distinction and starts to hold itself in being by means of it, the beginnings of the, quote, scientific revolution of the 17th century, is the moment at which the middle ground of objects and forms and ideas and practices, lying between the inhuman realm of nature and the human realm of culture, begins to proliferate. More and more things get drawn into social life, which will become more and more dependent upon and liable to be transformed by what it draws from and what it does with nature. Okay, and then he continues on, getting to what he says, postmodernism apprehends the unevenness of times, the mingling of old and new that belongs to the pre-modern or amodern apprehension, but clinging to the habits of modern thinking, sees it as a new development in the flow of time, a new kind of now. Okay, so let me unpack this. So as Latour was focusing on the human and the non-human, okay, this is where science emerges. We have nature in particular as a subject of study, and then we have the human or man as a subject of study, cleaving between the two. But then, as that was set up, there was the in-between space, the liminal space, as some people would like to describe it. where certain things that don't apply to the two start now to bleed into this in-between space. So then, as Connor was saying, the postmodern apprehends the unevenness, okay, not linear time, but that maybe it's circular, or maybe it starts and stops, or whatever it is. The old and the new, something I touched on earlier too, is that when you're looking at, in particular, architecture, if you go to a place like London, you're going to find a mix of many different kinds of architecture, some stemming back to the 18th century and then the 21st century, okay? So the old and the new mix, pre-modern, amodern apprehension, ways of understanding things, scientific mixed in with the supernatural or the occult, or as AOC likes to describe, feelings. I go by my feelings and not my facts. Okay. Okay, the postmodern, still because it is in the modern thinking, sees it a new development in the flow of time. It's a new kind of now. Okay. So that's the upshot of that. And then Connor continues saying that Latour objects to postmodernism because it turns the standing impossibility of being modern into a postmodern value. And this is perhaps the most lasting problem of postmodernism. Kind of touching on Bauman there in some respect. Because again, Bauman's main thesis is that, at least in the beginning, postmodernity was his term. Later on, he changed it for liquid modernity to describe the ever modernizing force that continues, but the ambivalence and the decentering, the delegitimation that is happening in the wake of things continue to being modern. And this is a problem of postmodernism, according to Latour. So he's very close to Bauman in that respect.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't quite get that last quote there. And even though you explained it, I still didn't quite follow what he's trying to say.
Okay, so I'll read it again. Latour's objection to postmodernism is that it turns the standing impossibility of being modern into a postmodern value. This is perhaps the most lasting problem of postmodernism.
Is it like how is he sort of saying that it makes it makes the modern a thing to pursue because people want to get beyond the postmodern, like a recurrence of that cycle or something? Or am I way off base?
Sounds sort of plausible to me. What do you think, Shane?
I don't understand why it's a problem. He just states it's a problem. I don't see what the problem is.
Okay, well, let me continue. Later on in the paragraph, he says, and this is Connor, not Latour, the more compelling postmodernism seems as a hypothesis, the more it seems that it might be a condition rather than an imperative. Aha, sounds like Bauman. And the more beside the point seems the question of how or whether one chooses to be a postmodernist. Choosing to be a postmodernist then starts to look like choosing to embrace contingency, when the point about contingency is that it chooses you for its own non-reasons. Is that any clearer?
No. No. It could be my tiredness. I'm not sure. But what page is this on in the book? Do you know?
This is on page 9.
This is page 9.
Yeah. Okay. First paragraph after the quote.
Okay.
There's a Latour quote at the top.
Okay, maybe it'll become. I mean, you could try to explain it again, or you could just continue on, and I can circle back on my own and try to figure it out and raise it again at a future time if needed. But I'm not quite sure.
Like you're curious about why this is a problem, or do you not understand what the problem is that he's describing, or both?
I'm not quite sure exactly what he's describing. I think implicit in there somewhere is an understanding of like what postmodernism could be or should be, but now isn't, or there's some sort of contradiction or something that's kind of implicit. I can't quite tease it out.
Okay. What do you think, Tim?
Well, let me go ahead and read the Latour quote that's above it. This might help explain things. So Latour says, quote, "The postmoderns are right about the dispersion. Every contemporary assembly is polytemporal, meaning existing at many times. But they are wrong to retain the framework and to keep on believing in the requirement of a continual novelty that modernism demanded. By mixing elements of the past together in the form of collages and citations, the postmoderns recognize to what extent these citations are truly outdated. Moreover, it is because they are outmoded that the postmodernists dig them up in order to shock the former, quote, modernist avant-gardes, who no longer know at what altar to worship. But it is a long way from a provocative quotation extracted out of a truly finished past to a reprise, repetition, or revisiting of a past that has never disappeared. Is that any clearer?
It almost sounds like we're just playing with ideas so much now that we're kind of eating ourselves or something.
Okay.
Like I don't know. I mean, it could just. I mean, maybe I might be missing the significance, but it sounds like it's become too self-referential in some way. But I could be completely wrong.
Okay. Well, let me try to quickly unpack it. So, the thing about modernism, again, modernism and not modernity, the artistic movement, is there was a framework involved, a reaction against modernity. Okay. So the modernists also were into continual novelty. What's the new way that we can shock people? And the modernist, maybe not explicitly or intentionally at the time, but again, if look at the early 20th century modernist painters, for example, the subjects. Okay, a perfect example is like Edvard Munch's The Scream. Okay, that's an early 20th century modernist work. Certainly caused a stir when it first came out. One of the most famous paintings in the world, and still causes a stir when people look at it. Okay, that was shocking back then when it emerged. And continuing, going into the 20s and 30s and 40s, and particularly when World War II is right around the corner, shocking in that way. New things were happening, different kinds of sculpture or paintings or whatever it is, the subjects that they were looking at. Okay, this is the continual novelty that he's referring to.
Yeah.
So the postmodernists are trying to do the same thing, but they're using the modernist framework in doing it. They mix elements of the past together in the forms of collages and citations. Okay, so then postmodernity, an example of art would be Marcel Duchamp and the ready-mades, like the urinal that's standing on its side, Dadaism, if you're familiar with that. Okay, that kind of falls under the postmodernist rubric.
Yeah.
But that's still sort of modernist when they're looking at that. And then the older forms, like a collage, is a modernist approach, but they're trying to shock by using that. And then they realize that these are outdated, that they should try something new. And then Latour says, it's because they are outmoded that the postmodernists dig them up in order to shock the former modernist avant-gardes who no longer know at what altar to worship. So the postmodernists are trying to circumvent or undercut what the modernists are doing.
Okay, I think I understand it well enough. Yeah.
Okay.
I think, at this point.
So then back to the Connor quote where he says, Latour's objection to postmodernism is that it turns the standing impossibility of being modern into a postmodern value. This is perhaps the most lasting problem of postmodernism. So as I read that is, postmodernism is trying to get beyond modernism, but fails.
Okay, that makes sense then. I think I got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay.
Okay.
Does that make sense to you, Andrew?
Yeah. That's another thing that sort of reminds me of this, like this liquid modernity that Bauman talks about.
Right, because again, in Bauman's thesis is the modern is still with us.
Yeah.
Even though, something like the nation state, like the Soviet Union, we'll say modernity par excellence in the 20th century, collapsed 1989. By 1991, it's gone. Psst, completely gone. But even though that collapsed, the modernizing impulse still exists.
Yeah.
and still continues apace. In fact, it's been speeding up since then.
Yeah.
Okay. So postmodernity, as the term that he originally used, really does not do it justice of what is happening, because it's still modernizing.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So moving right along. So if we go to page 10, Connor continues. He references Bell again. This is Daniel Bell. But if Bell is right when he says that modernism is surpassed by being diffused, so postmodernism may also be suffering the same fate. We have reached a situation in which the idea of postmodernism has both broadened and become simplified. Okay, so what's the problem here? What in the hell is postmodernism? It's just been so diffused, it's been so watered down, it's been so described every which way from Sunday that you can't really point to anything. But people like Jordan Peterson will like to use it as a boogeyman term, which falls, as we had seen, what Connor says, falls squarely within the third movement in the mid-90s, where you're really starting to see that emerge.
Yeah.
And then Connor continues, as postmodernism became generalized during its third phase in the 1990s, so the force of postmodernism as an ideal or a necessary premonition of the good seems also have begun to dissipate.
That's interesting. So it's like it started being moralized less.
Right. So then it became more of a diffused, even you could say an empty term. You know, it's not the hot term that it once was in the 70s and the 80s, because it broadened so much, it diffused so much was packed within it. And then, definitely in particular, as Connor was referring to, is that at least in the beginning, postmodernism seemed to apply more to the artistic realm, cultural realm. Now, not so much anymore, because, as you see now, this is like almost the end game. Anything that seems out of the ordinary, wackadoodle, or that runs up against what people would consider something as modernity, like science. I mean, like picture Sam Harris, okay?
Yeah.
Anything that goes against his scientific worldview, impoverished as it is, what would he say? That's postmodernism.
Yeah, exactly.
Somebody of his ilk would say that.
He does that, really?
I'm not saying he does, but somebody of his ilk does.
Oh, interesting. I've never heard it used that way. Maybe I just didn't notice it. I didn't really notice it maybe before Peterson came on the scene.
It's like anything that rejects modern narratives, basically, I would say.
Weird.
Right. So if you're wedded to the scientific method, you're some kind of a scientist, all right? And I'm not necessarily talking about Sam Harris or the intellectual dark web or any of those people. Somebody like that. And then if you have somebody coming along and questioning your methodology or your approach, wanting to delegitimize you, maybe not intentionally, and then you get butthurt and then you call that person a postmodernist.
Weird. I'll have to keep my eyes open for that, because I've never seen that phenomenon you're talking about.
Well, I think it happens.
It happens a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
Next time you guys run up against it, just send me the link if you're ever watching something or reading something that someone does that, because when what we read in the introduction is postmodernism is always what I hear them refer to when they refer to it. So far, exactly what you've been describing is exactly the way that I thought they've characterized it. So if when you see that dissonance there, please do, if you have a second, to point it out to me, because I would like to see where it's used in this boogeymanish way. Because I'm looking out to see where that is, and I'm not getting any kind of, I'm not able to see any example of it. So
you've never seen people, intellectuals, call someone a postmodernist if they're skeptical about the scientific method or something, or science in general?
No, I've heard people who are decentralized and delegitimizing things, like in the way that you described postmodernism earlier. When they do that, getting called postmodernist. I've heard people who being called anti-science. I've heard people being called charlatans or like other insults. But usually, and I could have just missed it. I'm not denying the possibility of it. but I've never heard it used as like a catch-all ad hominem for just rejecting my narrative. I've usually heard it for people who are saying things that sound exactly like, and it could be my superficial understanding, but that sound like exactly the kind of comments that I read throughout this book and that I saw.
What about this idea of scientism? You've heard of that before, right?
Yeah, I'm a big anti-scientism guy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, scientism is something that postmodernists talk about.
Like I say, that would be very scientism. Yeah, scientism has a bunch of baked-in assumptions that it complete doesn't acknowledge, so that I have a big problem with. So, yeah. So I mean, I like I say, like as a lens, I definitely think there's legitimate postmodern critiques of things. I just haven't heard it used in this ad hominem way you're describing. So I just haven't.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so Andrew, that's your homework.
Okay.
Next time you see something like that, you can pin it to MMA.
Okay. Doesn't sound difficult.
Okay. All right, so continuing along, we're almost done. So Connor says, of course, postmodernism shares with modernism its concern with the present, as well as its sense of the long or enduring present. But modernism's present was undefinable, a vertigo or velocity rather than a habitat. The presentness to which modernism was drawn was a hair-trigger affair, always on the brink of futurity. By contrast, the perpetual present of postmodernism is mapped, scheduled, dense with retrospection and forecast. The present, as of old, is all there is, but now it includes all time. There is nothing absent from this present, which makes it curiously spectral. This means, in its turn, that the present can start to age, to become old before its time. The present of postmodernism has come to seem like a stalled present, an agitated but idle meanwhile. Okay, this is an important thing about postmodernism too. So the compression of history and time. I think I've touched on this in other podcasts too, in particular with James when I was going over, I think it was Harvey. Harvey definitely pointed out things about space-time compression under late capitalism, which was also adding to the postmodern condition. But in particular, what Connor is getting at here is about the enduring present, which seems to be the case, and not just postmodernists, but other people like Douglas Rushkoff talks about present shock, where there doesn't seem to be this long view of history anymore. It is disjointed event after event after event after event. But, looking at it as a whole is, and this applies to me since I'm older than both of you guys, is 2019 really all that different from 1991?
Right.
In some respects it is, in other respects it isn't, because people wear more or less the same kind of clothes, just a little bit of a difference there. The Soviet Union is gone, so there's no longer the bipolar world. Terrorism has always been around, even when the Soviet Union did exist. People are still driving cars. They're a little more sophisticated, but cars are cars. The houses really don't look the same. So the difficulty here is the time is not punctuated like it once was many, many, many centuries ago or years ago.
I definitely see that really hyper focus on the present in today's culture, and I wonder if it's linked to the acceleration of technology and social media and stuff like that.
Yeah, I think so, because what's hot now, then people forget about a week or so from now.
Yeah.
Okay. Like
have you heard about the latest scandal this week? There's another one good that's going to happen next week. Can't wait.
Oh yeah. Or that you're starting to see recycling a lot more.
Yeah.
Let's look at a pop culture reference, is the Star Wars. Okay.
Yeah.
After they completely butchered The Last Jedi, for lots of different reasons, but you looked at that and you looked at The Force Awakens, particularly with The Force Awakens, I looked at that and was just like, Jesus Christ, is this not like the first series? Kylo Ren, doesn't he look like Darth Vader? Oh, the Star Killer base. Where have we seen that one before?
It's definitely a remake of The New Hope.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's the wider thing that's going on of a recycling. You're running up against limits. I mean, pop music in particular, just rehash after rehash after rehash. So these are just manifestations of this eternal present and this flattening that seems to be going on. But people who write in the postmodern vein like to talk about too. And then Connor is saying that it's it can start to age, become old before its time. Interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Comes to seem like a stalled presence, an agitated but idle meanwhile. Okay.
Yeah, it's like how people go out and buy the new iPhone every time it comes out, even though it's not that different from the last one.
No, it's not a significant upgrade from when the first iPhone came out, really.
Yeah.
Kind of looks the same, got more or less the same kind of apps, more of them, more sophisticated, nothing really earth-shattering new like when the iPhone first came out.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do you think, Shane?
I think one thing that's interesting is that how descriptively apt I'm finding this. Like in theory, we're doing a history of postmodernism, but in terms of the trends in society, it seems to be very perceptive, very descriptively accurate. So
Right.
it's funny. It's the narrative, this postmodern narrative, the unifying narrative across a 120-year period seems to be a very coherent narrative, which I find a little ironic because it seems to be very descriptive, and I agree with most of it. This whole enduring present thing, though, this is really pulling at my mind. I'm going to have to reflect on it a lot because on the one hand, I'm tempted to agree because I'm a big history nerd and I do see people don't really put themselves in a context historically. It does seem to be this blinking presence. On the other hand, like pre-internet, post-internet seems to be a huge shift.
Yeah,
And
that's
there's
what I was saying.
so I don't I see some aspects of culture. There is that rinse and repeat, but like it's almost banal. And the like style hasn't really they don't like there seems to be definite realms, especially architecturally, where things are become so commoditized and regurgitated. There I kind of see this no change thing happen. But I suspect, even though I can't articulate it, in other realms, you do see this epoch change thing kind of happen. Like websites would be a great example. Like you could look at a website from 90s, 2000s today. It's like you could tell it's like clothing. It's like clothing used to be back from the old day, right? You can look at the website and you know exactly what year. You could maybe even to the year guess.
Well,
So,
and you look at like social media too. That's a fairly recent development.
yeah. So there are aspects of let's say fashion, presentation, construction that I do see this change happening. So it's not an ever present, but at the same time, I do see areas where this line really holds true. But yeah, so those are my thoughts.
Right, and what you're doing is also, as I've been doing in reading Connor's essay, is focusing on the many nuances behind postmodernism. So again, Connor mentioned in the third stage in 1995 or so, mid 90s, is when you started to see the emergence of what you now have with identity politics and the like, except at a much, it's further down the road and it's much crazier now than it once was. And you use that as the encapsulation, definitely to a lot of people, as the boogeyman of postmodernism.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking about.
And what we don't like. However, as we have noticed with, the quasi along the same lines of what Bauman talks about it sociologically as this emergent phenomena of modernity, or it's in contradistinction to and a push-pull reaction against modernity, even though modernity is part of it.
Yeah.
And then Latour's mention of, what the postmodernists are trying to do to shock still, but using the modernist frameworks, which themselves are outdated.
Yeah.
So then that becomes a problem. And then this eternal present, long present, the things seem to be stuck in a rut, wash, rinse, and repeat, where it is another particular is we were focusing on a pop culture manifestation of what you could call the postmodern.
Yeah.
This condition.
And this like postmodern condition and postmodern era, which is descriptive, is one thing that I think people get confused about sometimes, as if like people like Bauman, for example, are actually advocating for these things that he's just saying descriptively.
Right. And he's not falling prey to describing it as a philosophy.
Yeah.
And it's not a philosophy necessarily. Yeah. It is, I still will take the task as that it's an emergent phenomenon. I'm very careful to use the term postmodernism, except maybe in a artistic cultural reference. I certainly don't want to describe it as a philosophy, even though the next essay, which we should save for another podcast, describes, lumps a lot of people under postmodern philosophy type of a moniker. People that span the gamut, including pragmatists and analytic philosophers and continental for the 20th century going forward, things like that, all lumped under that moniker of postmodern philosophy.
Yeah,
which is very highly nuanced.
I think it's Rorty, isn't it, who's sort of a pragmatist, but also like agrees with some aspects of postmodernism or something like that.
Yeah, of the philosophers, you could point to him and say, yeah, he exhibits postmodern. And in fact, some of his essays touch on things like Lyotard and postmodernity. But he's a pragmatist.
Yeah, I want to check him out. I still haven't, but I want to check him out for that.
I listened to like 30, 40 minutes. He sounded to be pretty on point. And then I heard somebody else talk about him indirectly. Then it sounded weird when I read some descriptions of it. But he definitely sounded like a pragmatist. Well, what's interesting, what I'm trying to figure out is it that people have hijacked the label for their own purposes?
I would say so.
I would say so too, yeah.
Okay, I think we'd all agree that's definitely happened. And I guess my question is, to what extent was that kind of the inevitable thing that such a tool would be used to do? Because I remember I can't remember what Nietzsche book it is, and he says that people will create a symbol or a talisman or for a purpose, but then once it exists, it can be picked up and used for a new one. Does this sound like something that you guys remember Nietzsche saying?
Well, yeah, for sure.
So
but would you say is like what I was saying though is in terms of like the postmodern era or the postmodern condition though, like that is not inevitable to become that kind of thing, because it's just like sociology or history. And
well, in some respects you could say, and this is retrospectively too, that the postmodern condition was inevitable.
Yeah.
Because the thing that pops into my mind as an analog to this is that when I took my art history class way back when I was an undergrad, and we started from, of course, Greek art, progressed through European and some of the Asian art, the different forms, how it changed, and so on and so forth, until you get to pop art. Okay. And bringing Jameson back into this in the postmodern condition, or whatever the title of his book is, I'm drawing a blank because it's late, where he drew a distinction between Van Gogh's shoes, that picture that Heidegger talks about in The Origin of the Work of Art, where the shoes are pointing to something beyond what they are, just as a pair of shoes. It opens up a world, you could say, versus the Campbell soup can with Andy Warhol, what does it point to? Or not the soup can, but the it was another painting it was Diamond Shoes, I think it was. But the soup can is a good replacement for that, because it's just soup can labels for that painting. What does it point to? Doesn't really point to anything, you could say.
Yeah.
So there's a clear distinction between those different kinds of artistic milieus. One is 19th century, more realist modernist, you could say, versus pop art, which is kind of at the end, and then again, a remembering from the art history course, is that once you got to pop art, what seemed evident is that you get a recycling going on. Sure, you could do a Renaissance type painting, but that's already been done, and you're just recycling it. It's neo-Renaissance. You stick the neo prefix in front of something.
Interesting. Okay, so
yeah, I wasn't saying that. Like, I wasn't saying that I don't think the emergence of the postmodern era is inevitable. I'm saying I don't necessarily think it was inevitable for the term postmodern to be hijacked by people, particularly postmodernism and postmodernist.
Right. As you were saying, Shane, and I like the term you used, is that it's an ad hominem. It's a term as an ad hominem attack.
Yeah.
What we don't like, what doesn't fit into something that reasonable quote people would accept. Well, that's postmodern.
Yeah.
It's been labeled. It's a boogeyman. Shove it aside. Attack it.
Yeah, like advocating for identity politics and activism.
Right. Right. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and finish. We're almost at the end. So Connor continues. He says, about the postmodern term, having been progressively more generalized over the 30 or so years during which it has been under development, postmodern discourse may now be entering a new phase of productive dissipation, in which some of the very cultural themes and phenomena that it has made its concern are now themselves achieving a kind of autonomy. Rather than embarking on a new round of synthesizing, this collection attempts to register the mass and velocity of some of these new areas of growth to which postmodernism has undoubtedly given rise. He's referring to the essays in the collection. And then he continues saying, the great difficulty for expositors of the postmodern is that there are so many separate histories of postmodernism that are internal to different disciplines and areas of culture, even as, from its beginning, postmodernism has consistently acted to knock individual disciples off center. Postmodernism was always a phenomenon of cultural interference, the crossing or conjugation of ideas and values. The end.
Okay. Well, then the one thought I'll leave you guys with is that it's statements like that one at the end that really makes me wonder. Cultural interference, like I've heard, postmodernism is cultural interference. Postmodernism is decentering. Postmodernism is delegitimizing.
Yes.
That to me is the toolkit of how identity politics people act out.
Yes.
They use those three tools to do those things. So what I'm hearing that on the one hand, it seems like there are threads of postmodernism, especially art, music, and different ways of exploring issues that have nothing to do with impacting things in a negative way. But it does seem to me that this distinction between the idea that there isn't some postmodernism boogeyman out there, I don't see how that isn't true. Not all postmodernists are boogeyman, but many boogeymen are postmodernists.
It's that it lumps all of these people into one category. But like you said, they're different. There are different types of people that are put under this umbrella by other people. Not all of them necessarily put themselves there.
Right, and the danger is when you lump them all together, that shows a lack of sophistication, at least to me. I mean, something that very closely parallels this is atheist. Okay.
Yeah.
Many different kinds of atheists.
Yeah.
Certainly many more than the Richard Dawkins and the Sam Harrises of the world.
Like,
and
I am not like those types of atheists.
Right, and in fact, atheism has been around for quite a long time.
Yeah.
There are many important historical atheists, some of which, I guess, I'd have to find it. I think it was, I forget who the lecturer was, but it was a theologian that I think even Frederick Barbarossa, the famed monarch during the Crusades, was something of an atheist because he doubted. So, and some of the 19th century atheists were far more sophisticated than Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris were.
Yeah. Like,
and as a matter of fact, you can be an atheist without shooting your mouth off all the time that you are an atheist, or making fun of people who do believe.
Oh, I don't know about that.
Well, what about me, Shane? I don't do that.
I'm teasing because it's the exact opposite of what you just said. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there have been many sophisticated atheists in the history of thought, very sophisticated.
Yeah.
And they have quite well thought out arguments, and they don't need to, well, at least the way I've read them is that they never seem to need to go on the road.
Yeah. I mean, like in my opinion, how my mind has changed on that, because I used to be a militant atheist like Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins, is that all I can say is that I don't believe in the existence of God, and here is why. If someone does believe in God, I can't say that they're wrong or immoral in any way. That doesn't make sense.
You used to.
Yeah, I did used to.
Well, one thing I'll point out though is that if you had a center and you had a grand narrative and you had a legitimate source, then you would have tighter definitions, and you'd be able to use words in a way that the other people would understand you more commonly, right? So I think it's part and parcel of postmodernism. This is going to be my thesis, that it's not surprising that postmodernism gets mislabeled, because nobody is the center definition of what it is. There is no center of it.
Yeah.
There is no legitimate definition of it. So this is where I think it's kind of baked. I suspect it's baked into postmodernism, that postmodernism would find itself in this problem.
But it's not baked into postmodernism though. It's some, like you've said, some people have misappropriated the term.
Yeah, but I think if postmodernism is decentering, if it is delegitimizing, if it is being counter, okay, then you would be a postmodernist would intentionally delegitimize the old definition of postmodernism to now to be the new post.
Let's look at a parallel example though. The Westboro Baptist Church. They call themselves Christians. Most people who are Christians do not identify with them at all.
Okay.
But they still call themselves Christians.
This will be a topic we'll come back to. So I think, given the time, I mean, I'm not trying to just cut and run or anything, but that's Well, this is going to be. We're not going to solve this one tonight. So we'll just kind of like we've been doing is just dip into it.
I'm not looking to go off on a tangent right now. Don't worry.
Just in general, I think we'll just talk. Well, this is the same theme I'll keep bringing up. So each time we'll just do a couple sentences and then we'll move on, and then that way keep us speaking the same language.
Just wed to the Peterson narrative.
Well, let me leave us with a closing thought. So,
great.
The thing about postmodernism is that it's a what's the words I'm looking for? It's an empty term.
Yeah.
The problem comes in where people will take it and, for lack of a better term, they will essentialize it, saying, oh, this is what postmodernism is, a specific definition, throw it out there, and then unsophisticated folks, yes, I will call them unsophisticated, will take it and run with it like a dog runs with a bone.
Yeah.
And then lots of them have no compunction to use it to beat you over the head with it, because somebody has already given it a definition, and then they turn it into a weapon to turn against you, and that's where the ad hominem comes in. But because it is something of an empty term, those of us who are a little bit more sophisticated, who can read into that, knowing that it is an empty term and it's an inadequate term that could mean a whole lot of different things all at once. And that's why, I want to bring Bauman into this again. He ditched the term postmodernity in favor of liquid modernity, because postmodernity at the time, because they had some cachet to it in the early 90s, was the term to use until later on, around 2000, when he came up with another term that was a little more descriptive. And then postmodernism kind of sunk out of sight in the late 90s and early 2000s, and now it's back.
Yeah.
Going back to my cockroach example.
Yeah.
Oh, interesting.
Shane doesn't like cockroaches.
Yeah, I don't think anybody does.
No.
Okay, and so we have completed the introductory essay. So I think next time we will take one of the other essays. We don't necessarily have to start with philosophy. We
Sure.
could do like art or literature or architecture, whatever it is, because there's many essays in this rich collection that is called the Cambridge Companion to Postmodernism. And that's all I'm going to say for tonight.
Yeah, okay. Well, here,
Awesome.
just to make it, just to do the organization while we can actually go back and forth in real time, let's just say we'll start with one of the ones that's more postmodern in the sense of the art or architecture.
Sure.
So why doesn't Tim pick one of those?
Yeah.
And then you pick whichever one you want to do second, Andrew. And I don't think we'll really get through more than two in one sitting. But in case we do, I'll try to have my third one on the line. And if we manage to do three and it's only been an hour, well, then God love us. We can just rest on our laurels because we've been so productive. So
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Awesome.
Sounds good.
Okay. Have a great night, guys. Great talking to you. Thanks
All
for
right.
your time.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thanks for participating, guys, and thanks everyone for watching. Thanks to those of you who subscribe and share this video, and especially to those of you who contribute to me on Patreon. I really appreciate that, and I'll add the link to the description of this, as I always do. And like I always say, I love you all. Keep being the tiny beam of light that shines through the almost impenetrable darkness in the universe, and keep having mindgasms. And if you guys are still there, you can give any last words or not.
Don't beat people over the head with the word postmodernism.
Yeah, I agree. All right. Okay, so yeah. All right. Thanks again, and adios until next time.